if ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis thou. In mansions of glory and endless delight, I'll ever adore thee in heaven so bright. I'll sing with a glittering crown on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis thou. Amen. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you for the hands that made this food tonight, that prepared it and had it here for us as we came. I pray mostly and with much concern for our nation. God, we're being attacked on all sides. We know that Satan is against us and coming after us. But God, you know, I read the book, and I read it all the way to the end, and I know how it ends. But God, I'm asking you to give us some real power that we know that we have, power that we know that we can use. And God, take away the fear. We don't need fear. I pray for the politicians who fear God. I pray for them in this country, in the federal state, and the state and the local level, that everywhere there's people who are serving our nation, who are Christians and who know God. God, I want you to continue to send people to Fairview Baptist Church. I look forward to listening to Dan's message tonight, and I pray for Paul and Cindy's quick return. Amen.
Brother, appreciate it so much. You guys can be seated. I'm carrying with me tonight a box of Black Robe T-shirts. You know, whenever we purchase T-shirts, you never know how many of each size to get. It's one of the reasons why for a while we'd quit carrying them, because it's just so hard to keep the proper inventory. This is the last of our inventory, and all I have are 4X. I want to say 4L. 4X T-shirts. If any of you want a 4X T-shirt, I have T-shirts here. So see me after we're done. Okay? All right. Hopefully I can get those going. All right. Well, hopefully you have your outline from last week, but if you do not, if you'll raise your hand, we'll get one to you. But these are on a limited basis. I have 15 of them. So hopefully we have just enough. So if you have one at home or whatever, why, make sure that everybody else gets one first, and then. Okay, what we want to do. Oh, I have to hook this up, don't I, Dan? It's not going to work if it's not hooked in there. I kept waiting on him. I'm thinking, man, do your job here, buddy. Now we ought to be good to go. It hiccuped, so it ought to work here pretty quick. Anyway, we started this lesson last week, so you ought to have your outline from last week. And if you guys could pull the lights down just a little bit. There we go. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. We want to get right into what we were studying last week. And we want to cover as much of this as we possibly can. Obviously, I'll try to finish the outline. If you have your outline, pull it out. Does everybody have an outline that needed one? Or did we run out? Did I print one too few? Is that what I did? Okay. Well, hang on here just a second. Let me go back onto the internet here. And I'm going to... give me just a second so you guys are seeing all this nonsense up here. But let me see if I can pull up a... it'll take me just a second to find it. Okay, now I'm going to print. How many more do we need? I'm going to print 10 more. Let's make sure that it's receiving it. It's telling me that it is. Look at there. It's talking. It's going good. There we go. Okay, so in just a moment, the printer is going to spit out 10 more of those. So we need someone to get into the office area. Stan or somebody, if you could get me off the printer in the print room, off of Sue's office. There'll be 10 more copies coming at us here pretty quick. Okay, so modern technology is incredible, isn't it? Okay, just as soon as we switch over, we'll be ready to go here. Okay, so we want to pick up where we were last week, but I want to run through just very quickly for those of you who may not have been here. We're talking about the church, the IRS, and the Johnson Amendment. It's very important for Christians to know what our history is, what the status is of the church and the 501c3 and all that. Why 501c3? What about the Johnson Amendment? All this. So let's run through very quickly, just a quick review. I'm just going to jump through this. Number one, Scripture does teach that we should pay our taxes, so this is not a lesson intended to make rebels out of us. The Bible clearly teaches this. Romans 13 says that we need to pay our taxes because proper government operates as God's ministers, so render therefore to all to whom all is due. Jesus' birth in Bethlehem was caused by taxation. Luke 2:1 teaches that. And I'm going to move through this very quickly. If you weren't here last week, you'll have to go online and get it. Jesus fellowship with tax collectors. The Bible's incredibly clear about that. Matthew 9:11, Jesus chose a tax collector as one of his disciples. That would be Matthew. If you'll raise your hand, there'll be an outline coming around. So if you need one, lift your hand. That's in Mark 2:14. Jesus actually paid his taxes. The story in Matthew 17 of him sending Peter out to catch a fish, and in that fish's mouth is going to be the money to pay his taxes. And then, of course, Jesus taught others to pay their taxes, rendered to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and, not or, and to God the things that are God's. So you can render to Caesar and to God all at the same time. And Scripture teaches this. And then we talked about the church and its tax-immune status. Anybody else need an outline? I think there was a hand up here. The church and its tax-immune status, I choose the word immune. It could be tax-exempt. But tax-immune, the church's tax-exempt status is not a gift bestowed by benevolent government. I went through the quote here by Eric Stanley, who is an Alliance Defending Freedom attorney. But he says, you know, if many will say, well, if the church wants us to lose its tax-exempt status and talk about political issues, they can. And he said, well, that would be okay if it wasn't so completely wrong, because this is not a gift. Well, why is that? Well, because the framers saw the church as a sovereign entity and therefore tax-exempt. They believed that a sovereign entity cannot tax another sovereign entity. We spent a lot of time on that last week. So this is why the federal government can tax the state of Oklahoma. At the same time, the state of Oklahoma cannot tax the state of Maryland, or the state of Oklahoma cannot decide they're going to tax the federal government. There's actually some cases that deal with that. One of them was in 1819, Mccullough versus Maryland, which was the state of Maryland wanting to tax the first U.S. bank. And in doing that, what they were trying to do is tax the federal government. And so the whole point is sovereigns cannot tax other sovereigns. Well, the framers believed that the church was a sovereign entity. So you can go through history and see how early on the states and or colonies were exempting the church from property taxes. Why? Well, because they believed the church was a sovereign entity. And even today, as a sign of that, the parsonage that many churches provide to pastors is not taxable, and or a housing allowance, because of the whole concept of the church being a sovereign entity. And it was Representative Mack who was the one who fought that through in Congress in 1953, and then as recently as the year 2000, the IRS tried to go after the housing allowance that is a part of a pastor's pay, and once again failed, and eventually causing Congress to pass the Clergy Housing Allowance Clarification Act in 2002. Now, that in and of itself is not important as much as it is a symbol of the concept that the church has always been tax exempt in America. So one of the reasons is because the framers believed that the church is a sovereign entity. It's separate from the government. It's not like an individual citizen, and therefore the government did not have the right to meddle in it, which of course is part of what the First Amendment is about. The inability of the government to make laws restricting the practice of religion and our religious expression. Then another reason why the church in America has always been tax exempt is because the framers believed that the power to tax also gives the government the power to control and ultimately, if they choose to destroy. This comes out of that Mccullough versus Maryland case where the attorney Daniel Webster made the first statement that an unlimited power to tax involves necessarily a power to destroy. So if you want to put something out of business, if you can tax it, you can just tax it out of business, right? And so the framers did not want government having that kind of power over religious expression. So they kept it separate. So number one, the church is a sovereign entity. That's the first reason that the framers believed that the church couldn't be taxed. Second reason is they believe the power to tax brings with it the power to control, and the very concept of freedom of religion, of course, would be ruined if the government had the power to tax the church, and therefore if they wanted to shut a preacher up or shut a church up, just tax them into oblivion. So they understood this, and so ultimately in that case of Mccullough versus Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall actually repeats in his official opinion what Daniel Webster had said, that the power to tax, you can see at the very bottom there, involves the power to destroy, and they certainly believe that. So as recently as 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed this same concept. So this concept has been tested in American history over the decades and centuries. So as recently as 1971, this very same thing came up, and at that time, Chief Justice Warren Burger, referring to a case from 1970, now so these are two different cases. Lemon versus Kurtzman is the 71 case, but he refers to the 1970 case. He said it was argued that tax exemption for places of religious worship would prove to be the first step in an inevitable progression leading to the establishment of state churches and state religion. That claim could not stand up against more than 200 years of virtually universal practice embedded in our colonial experience and continue into the present. So what Warren Burger was saying is that it has always been the case in America that the church is beyond taxation. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's important that we understand in our history. And then we ended, I believe, here with my comment that it's simply insane to believe that the framers would have fought an 8-year war to get out from under tyranny, out from under totalitarian government, to then just turn around and create another kind of government that could do the same thing to them. And so they wanted to limit the government's power to intrude into our unalienable rights, of which one of those is the freedom of religion and the free exercise of that religion. And by the way, they did other things to protect us. And so when you think about it, would it make sense then for them to have fought that 8-year war, then to create a Supreme Court that decides everything? So do you think they'd have fought 8 years, set up 3 co-equal branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, but they intended for the judicial to have more power than everybody else, and so ultimately everything is decided by the votes of 5 judges. There's 9 on the Supreme Court, but of course the majority is 5. No, of course not. So the whole concept that everything is decided by the Supreme Court runs contrary to everything that our framers fought for. So see, even today, our view of the court, so right now everybody's waiting with bated breath for tomorrow to see what the Supreme Court does with these vaccine mandates. Now, we know there's not going to be a decision, but many believe that they're going to put at least a temporary stay. So we're all sitting waiting for the Supreme Court. So we're waiting for the Supremes to decide what is and is not constitutional. See how crazy that is? So what that basically does is it eliminates the other two branches of government, because whatever they do can be trumped by 5 justices on the Supreme Court or 9, but at least 5. Well, it's ridiculous. So basically, if our present belief about the Supreme Court is correct, then what the framers should have done is just not have the 2 other branches and just created a court and said the courts will rule us. You see what I'm getting at? So we've lost the understanding of religious liberty, freedom of speech, unalienable rights, our understanding of what our republic is and how it functions. And so today, everything's upside down. So this is why so many do not understand. So they think that since the church is not taxed, then pastors don't pay taxes. That's completely incorrect. Any employee of the church is taxed at the same rate as any other employee of any other business. So individually, I pay income taxes just like you do. Now, because pastors fall into a very weird category of employed, and at the same time they're kind of semi-self-employed, they have certain tax breaks that other people in businesses have, like we can have expense accounts, which can include mileage and meals and that kind of stuff. The only thing that a pastor gets that no one else gets the chance at, if they want it, is a housing allowance, which probably in time, well, I don't know. In 2000, they upheld it, so who knows what's going to happen there. But, of course, you have to be able to prove it. You can't just reach out of thin air and grab a number. I mean, you have to have a house, and you have to be doing all the things that would make it qualify. But my point is, it's just insane for us to believe that they fought the war that they fought to have the nutso job, the crazy town that we have going on today in America. Number 5, which is now new material, the framers, the third reason why the church is tax exempt, is the framers believed the church was essential for a people to be self-governing. So the first reason is one sovereign cannot tax another sovereign, right? Second reason, the power to tax is the power to control and or destroy. So they kept the church clear of that. And then the third reason is that they believed that for America to be self-governing, for America to be a republic, then you had to have religious activity. You had to have a heavy impact of Christianity. So let's look through this just a little bit. A few weeks ago, as we did our separation of church and state myth series, we talked some about this, so we're going to come back to it. This is what the First Amendment is all about. Now remember, just very quickly, some mental arithmetic here. When the Constitution was first published to the people, many of those who had fought for it were now against it. Now remember, I've mentioned that. Do you know who one of the most outspoken groups was against the original Constitution? The preachers, the Black Robe Regiment. The very ones who had recruited men from their churches and communities and let them off to fight. Once the Constitution was released to the public, they were now speaking out against it. And the primary reason is because the Constitution only listed the positive powers of government. Now that's something you might want to remember. File it away in your mind somewhere. Positive powers. What does that mean? What the government can do. Well, what are the negative powers? What the government cannot do. And see, the founding generation was far more concerned about what the government could do to them than what it might do for them. So they were afraid of government. They had seen the abuses from the crown and from Parliament, and they knew all too well in world history that government can be a terrible thing and can be abused and become a tyranny and take away the rights of the people. So things like private property rights, well, you don't have those anymore. It's the king's forest. It's the king's land. Your farm is the king's. See, this is the old Soviet Union or Russia. Same kind of stuff. So they were very afraid of what government could do. So they wanted to put as many handcuffs on this new government that they were creating as they possibly could. So it looked like the Constitution was going down in flames. So James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution and the leader of the pack, said, well, listen, here's what we'll do. We'll write some amendments to this Constitution that will outline the negative powers. And we will commit to you that'll be the first thing we'll do. We'll put those out for ratification. And when those amendments are ratified, they'll immediately become a part of the Constitution. He wrote 12, 10 of them were ratified, and that became the what? Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. I would argue, other than maybe just a few more, those are the only amendments to the Constitution that have actually been helpful. In my opinion, many of the amendments to the Constitution have actually weakened our liberties and have created problems for us. Things like the 17th Amendment. You know, we're in trouble with a lot of these amendments. The IRS is created by an amendment. It's terrible. It's just awful. They've become the Gestapo. I mean, they're basically identical to the brown shirts. Isn't it amazing right now what you're hearing on the news, that they're understaffed, and so they're going to have a problem getting your tax refund to you? Do you think they're understaffed if you underpay? Do you think they're shy on agents to come get you? No. No. It's only when you owe them money that they're interested in time. Be quick. But when they owe you money, well, you'll get it when you get it. It is also interesting that if they've overtaxed you, when you get your refund, there's no interest or penalties that they paid you. But if you underpay them, guess what they'll attach to that? Interest and penalties. You're talking about a lopsided kind of justice that we have. And we've stood for it all these years. We're in real trouble here. We have been conditioned to accept tyranny. And we just accept it in little doses. It's terrible what we've been taught or conditioned to accept. And I think a lot of this is because pastors in the pulpits don't teach classes like this. They're not going to teach this because it's political and that's wrong or somehow betraying some passage of Scripture, and so they just don't do it. Of course, they believe in the lie of separation of church and state. So, all right, so First Amendment, you all know what the First Amendment says. Congress shall make no law. What part of no law did they not understand? Because they've passed all kinds of laws that then proceed to limit all of these things that are about. Congress shall make no law. By the way, if you read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, if you'll read it carefully, it's really created to limit the federal government, not the state governments. The incorporation doctrine is what has been used to force the Bill of Rights onto the states. And the problem with that is then it gives the federal government the power to tell the states what to do. See, if you read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, they were written to limit the federal government. This is why it says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about a state legislature. Now, a lot of people say, well, Dan, because you just don't know the incorporation doctrine. Well, first of all, the incorporation doctrine really doesn't exist. It's made out of thin air. There is no corporation doctrine in the Constitution. You can read the 13th and 14th Amendments upside down, forwards, backwards, inside out, and you will not find the incorporation doctrine. Now, let me prove that to you. Most of you know who Antonin Scalia was. Probably one of the most conservative Supreme Court justices that we've had in many, many decades. Some would argue ever. But in his book, that he wrote a number of books, but on his book, Understanding the Law, he was talking about the incorporation doctrine. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said. I probably should have looked up the quote and gave it to you, but I didn't plan on giving it. But here's what he said. He said, when it comes to the incorporation doctrine, most of us realize it isn't there. But to protect the integrity of the court, we're going to have to pretend that which is not there is there. That's what Antonin Scalia said. And then he goes on to talk about stare decisis, or what we most commonly call case law. See, many of them are more worried about the institution than they are what's actually constitutional. They want to protect the institution. Because see, here's the problem. If they ruled that the incorporation doctrine doesn't actually exist, they'd have to go back and retry all those cases that were decided upon the incorporation doctrine. Well, they don't want to do that. So they'd rather protect the court and its reputation than your rights. That's what Antonin Scalia said. See, that's a problem. That's a problem. That's why we're in such deep trouble now. And I don't know that America as we know it can be saved. I think it's a moot point. Now, we might save the republic in parts of the country. I personally do not think you can fix. It's gone too far. I think it's unfixable. All right, so it goes on to say, Congress shall make no law respecting what? Establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then it goes on to talk about freedom of speech and press and all that. Obviously, we're just talking about freedom of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Why do you think that was such an important thing that it was listed first? Well, it was listed first because, as we saw in our myth of separation, they understood that if you limit Christianity in America, it will devolve from a republic into an oligarchy, which eventually just becomes a tyranny. So the critical parts here, no law. And then what? No law about what? Well, establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise. And by the way, when it says establishment of religion, what they're thinking of is the Church of England. See, the Church of England was the established church in Great Britain. But see, today, establishment of religion has been stretched so out of shape that it means if you allow a nativity scene in at the courthouse at Christmas time, or if you allow kids to pray at school. Well, that's establishing a state church. You're forcing people at gunpoint to join that church. See, it's utterly ridiculous, but we stand by, and it's happened, and it's happened, and it's happened, and we do nothing about it. And then, of course, it goes on to talk about the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and then the right to approach our government, to petition all the grievances that we have. So just as a refresher from the myth of separation lesson, notice that John Adams, first vice president, second president, says, "It is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue. And if this cannot be inspired into our people in a greater measure than they have it now," he goes on to say, "then we'll lose it." So notice what he's saying here. He is saying that if we do not have a strong witness of the church in America, we will not be a free people. We will not be a self-governing people. Here's what he wrote to the Massachusetts military on October the 11th, 1798. "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." Meaning if the morality is not there, it's because religion isn't there. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Notice he's telling us something here. Christianity is critical for our republic. Of course, George Washington said the same thing in his farewell address. He said, the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion, and morality are indispensable. Now, you've seen these quotes before, but notice this, they're telling us here. To have a self-governing people, you have to have a moral people. And the only way you're going to have a moral people is if they're influenced by Christianity. That's what they meant when they said religion. They didn't mean Buddhism or Hinduism. They're talking about Christianity. So they understood that without this, what happens then is you have to have more government. So this is what Benjamin Franklin meant when he said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." What he means by masters is more government. So what's everybody crying out for today? More government. More government. Look at what happens when COVID first comes along and nobody knows exactly what we're facing. What did they start yelling for? Government, government, government. Need government, need government. See, I was saying from the very beginning, keep the government out, keep the government out. Let the doctors solve it. No government, no government. But what happens? Government gets in. Once government gets in, they foul it up. Everything they get into, they foul up. It's unbelievable to watch how bureaucracy works. Let me give you a good example. Right now, Charlie Meadows is having to stay in a nursing center because he presently is unable to still eat because of the surgery, so he has to survive with a feeding bag that's putting nutrients into his body. So he's having to stay in a nursing center. They won't let him go home even though Linda could take care of him, and the reason why is because he'll have to pay for that out of pocket. But if he stays in a nursing center, then they'll go ahead and pay for it. Now think about the idiocy of that. They're going to pay the extra of room and all of that rather than letting him go home where that part would be free. That's bureaucracy for you. That's what happens when government gets a hold of stuff. Because, see, eventually somebody does something because they're getting a perk from some business. The entire time I was in the legislature, we tried unsuccessfully, and forgive me if I'm about to offend someone, to allow people to actually purchase a casket like you would purchase tires for your car. You could go online. You could go to a retail place. Now, I realize you're saying, oh my gosh, why you bring that up? Well, here's the reason. Because the funeral home conglomerate, lobbyist group, would constantly stop it because they have a monopoly on it, and they wouldn't allow citizens to buy things like you would on the free market because they won't make nearly as much money, and they stopped it every time. There are some states where you can actually do that, not in Oklahoma. So see, every time the government gets its hands into something, somebody's getting a break or a kickback or something, and it limits freedom. So this is what Franklin's warning us about. He says once people become corrupt, they cannot self-govern, and they're going to be begging for more government. Well, see, the framers understood this, so they wanted Americans to be moral so that we won't be corrupt and vicious and won't need more government. And the only way they believed that people could be moral is if they were exposed to the gospel. So they believed that the church was actually the insurance of keeping us free. Because as the church influenced people, they'll be more moral. As they're more moral, they can govern themselves and they don't need bigger government. So that's another reason why the church has always been in America then tax exempt. We're going to have to move quicker. I'm not going to finish this. Number 6. During the entire history of the Internal Revenue Service, this is a surprise to a lot of people, not one church has ever lost its tax exempt status because of political speech. Now, I really should have put a slide that prepared us for that, so let me kind of do that right now. What about then the IRS? Because so many pastors and churches are scared to death. If we say something political from the pulpit, they're going to come after us. Well, that would be scary if it weren't so completely untrue. Not one time in the history of the IRS has a church lost its nonprofit status, its tax-exempt status, because of political speech. Now, I will tell you this. We keep giving ground, and we keep staying unengaged, and pastors keep being scaredy cats and all that kind. They will eventually come in and clamp down on us. It's a matter of time. They're already doing it in Canada. And my friend down in Baton Rouge, he was arrested for not closing his church, arrested 33 times. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that's the United States of America. Had to go all the way to the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to get his arrests overturned. Fought all the way through the state court system and lost every time. That's America. Now, did you hear that in the news? No. In fact, you didn't even hear it from Christian news because not even the Christian news would cover it. Now, why in the world wouldn't they think that was newsworthy? But they didn't. At the rally outside the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, when I was there speaking at that rally, I asked the crowd, where is AFA? For that matter, where's ADF? Where's TBN? Where's all these Christian networks? Not a one was there. Not one Christian media person was at that rally. Now, why wouldn't they cover this story? Surely they realized this was groundbreaking. Well, you tell me. But so people are so afraid we're going to lose our non-tax status, and this is why a lot of times pastors won't speak out. The only church that ever was even really prosecuted in what you'd call true prosecution by the federal government through the IRS was the church at Pierce Creek in Binghamton, New York. On October the 30th, 1992, they published full-page ads in the USA Today and the Washington Times telling Christians in America they shouldn't vote for Bill Clinton as president. Now, if you want to get political, that's about as political as you can get. And not only did they do that, they actually solicited donations in the advertisements. So not only are they encouraging people how to vote, they are also asking for donations. Now, most churches wouldn't have done that second part. At least, of course, I don't know of a church that would do this. That's what this church did. Now, the IRS went after them, and you can say, well, I'm sure they lost their nonprofit status. No, the only thing that the IRS was successful in doing is they took away what is called their advanced tax-exempt letter that the church received when it filed as a 501c3 organization the many years before. Now you say, well, what in the world is that? Well, what that is that's when a church forms into a 501c3, and by the way, we'll talk about 501c3s here in just a moment, but when a church becomes a 501c3 and they file with the government, the IRS checks them out, makes sure they qualify, and then the IRS sends a letter of intent saying, this is a letter saying that it appears that you qualify and therefore you're tax exempt. But even though this advanced letter was revoked, Pierce Creek never lost its tax exempt status because you don't have to have that letter to be tax exempt. All you have to do is qualify to be a church. So you don't need the IRS's permission to be a church. See, this is all legal mumbo jumbo and red tape. But that's the worst that they were able to do to that church. So, an important note here, an advanced letter of tax-exempt status is not required for a church to be tax-exempt. In fact, a church does not even have to officially file as a 501c3 organization to be tax-exempt. Churches are automatically tax-exempt. Whether a church officially files as a 501c3 organization or not, the IRS treats them as such. That is very important. Most people don't know that. See, most people think that a church has to be a 501c3 or they're not tax exempt. That is completely untrue. There are many churches across America today that are not 501c3s and they are still tax exempt. And when people give to them, they're giving to a charity. You say, why in the world then 501c3? Well, back in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, churches were convinced by attorneys. Maybe these attorneys were well-meaning, I don't know. But there was a kind of a wave that swept through the church. You know, throughout my history of being a Christian and then being a pastor, I've seen different waves pass through America and through the church. I've seen the charismatic wave. I've seen the leadership wave. I've seen the grace movement. Today we're in the church growth movement. So everybody believes that their church is supposed to be the size of Life Church, and every pastor is supposed to be a CEO, and that your church is really a religious organization, and it ought to be bigger than the one down the street. And so this whole church growth movement, and pastors are taught how to leverage the gospel and how to make the best out of your church and to market yourself. Some of these things are okay in their proper places. I mean, we always want to put our best foot forward and all that. And there is a business side of the church. I mean, we do need to take care of business. But the church is not a business. It's not a corporation. That's what the C, by the way, stands for in 501c3. It means corporation. So when a church becomes a 501c3 corporation, it falls under corporate law, which could someday come back to bite us. So then why did all these churches start becoming 501c3s? Well, back in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, there were lawsuits by ambulance chasers who would find someone that had slipped and fallen at a church, or someone that spilled hot coffee into their lap at McDonald's, who would then sue the church. Now, I don't know that this ever happened, but the fear was if somebody slipped and fell here, let's say at Fairview, and it was our negligence that caused them to fall, they could sue not only Fairview, but every member of the church. Now, I don't know that that ever happened. I don't even know that that would hold up in court. But everybody was terror-stricken when they found this out. And so the way around that was to incorporate the church as a 501c3, and that way all they could do was sue the corporation. They couldn't sue the individual members. And I can tell you that's why most churches early on filed as 501c3s. When I was younger, churches were not 501c3s. Hardly ever did you even hear about a 501c3. And certainly most churches were not. But starting somewhere in about the mid-70s to the late 70s into the early 80s, churches became terror-stricken by possible litigation and lawsuits from people who were going around trying to get injured so they could then sue for money. And churches were told the way to protect yourself is to become a 501c3. But before that movement ever happened, guess what churches were considered? Tax exempt. Because the church always has been in America. Churches today do not have to be 501c3s. In fact, the church that I was a part of helping to start over in Yukon, Liberty Church, Yukon, is not a, well, let me put it this way. They were not a 501c3 when I was still there. They're just a church. Now, Oklahoma has a little bit of a problem, and that is if you don't have a federal tax number, which is what you have to file for to get the 501c3 and all, you get this federal tax number, then they tax churches in Oklahoma if you buy stuff. So, like if you go to Lowe's and it's not you, it's Fairview who sent you down there with the Fairview credit card to buy lumber to build a new building. If you don't have a federal tax number and that federal tax exemption form, then Lowe's is going to charge you sales tax, which I believe should be tested and ought to be unconstitutional, just to be honest with you. You shouldn't have to have a federal tax number. There ought to be some other way to prove that you're actually a legitimate church. Now, I think churches need somehow to have to be able to prove that they're an actual church, because people could go start fake churches just to avoid taxes, and they're not really a church. They're actually a business, but they're working under the facade of it. So I think that there's a legitimate need for a church to be able to prove that it's actually a church. But I don't think it ought to have a federal tax number to do so. But in Oklahoma, you do. That should be challenged and changed. But the bottom line is this. A church is not taxed, and a church does not have to become a 501c3. In fact, with the deterioration of our government, I'm starting to suggest that pastors not become a 501c3. And if they are, they might want to consider undoing that, because of the hostility that exists in our government. So let's go back to that church that ran those full-page ads in the New York Times and the USA Today. They took away their letter. Now, I want you to listen to what the court then said about that. Because of the unique treatment churches receive under the Internal Revenue Code, the impact of the revocation, that's that letter, is likely to be more symbolic than substantial. Catch that. Symbolic. So what they did to that church at Pierce Creek was meaningless. It was just symbolic. All that will have to be lost, all that will have to have been lost is the advance assurance of deductibility in the event a donor should be audited. So in other words, if you gave to that church and they'd lost their letter, the IRS might question it, but if that church is still functioning as a nonprofit, you're good. But that letter could be a little bit of a smokescreen. And then the court goes on to say to prevent the church from reapplying, the court said there's nothing that would keep that church from reapplying for a prospective determination of its tax-exempt status, regaining the advance assurance of deductibility. In other words, Pierce Creek could have reapplied for that stupid letter. Now, if they really started playing hardball, you know what the church could do? If the IRS started exempting everybody's donations to the church, just disband and reform Monday morning under a different name. That's all you'd have to do. I mean, they want to play dirty, we'll play dirty too. I mean, the point is, all of this is symbolic. And then, of course, Matt Staver, Paul and I have gotten to know Matt very well. He is the founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel, which is one of the more effective legal organizations that exists in America that protects people's rights. And, of course, Matt is a born-again Christian. He's a member of Liberty Orlando, where Paul is preaching again this Sunday. He was part of that church start. Matt speaks either live or sometimes he makes a special video for us. But and I'm not going to read this whole quote to you, but basically he says after the letter ruling was revoked, the church could continue as a church, continue receiving donations. Donations could continue to claim deductions on their income tax return, provided that the church did not run those other two full-page ads. I mean, basically he's saying if they'll quit breaking the rules, everything's good. My point is, what the IRS does is typically all bark and no bite. That has been the case in the past. But see, I believe Hillary Clinton's job was to change that. And there was a variable that they didn't count on, and that was a real estate developer from New York City named Donald Trump. And he messed up the apple cart. And when he first announced, and I'm sure you've heard these montages by now of all these talk show hosts making fun of Donald Trump, what a stupid thing this was. Please go ahead and run. You don't have a prayer. Ha, ha, ha. Because he beat Hillary Clinton. By the way, have you heard the news today? Of course, it isn't just today, but they're already talking another Hillary run. So we've got that to look forward to. So the point is, the IRS has basically been a lot of bark and no bite. But Hillary's job, I believe, and without her getting elected, that doesn't mean they stopped on their plan. Barack Obama has been working behind the scenes all along. People are always wondering who's pulling Biden's chains. I can tell you that's who it is. It's Barack Obama and his circle. But today, with what's going on, I promise you, if we don't stand up and if the church does not become outspoken, this is all going to change. They're going to come after the church with a vengeance. You say, well, it's not legal. Well, when did that stop them? How much stuff are they doing right now that's completely wrong? What about all of these people that are being held in solitary confinement and have not even been arraigned yet for the January 6th thing last year? Now, I can tell you what happened was stupid in many instances, and I said that on Sunday. It's ridiculous. But when was the last time that you saw an attempted insurrection with nobody having arms? Because not any of those people were armed. The only people that were armed were the Capitol Police. And I'm not going to diss them because they were put in a terrible situation. I understand there's all kinds of stories out there about it was all a setup. I actually do believe that there were plants in the crowd from Antifa and other groups. But still, a lot of those people that were Trump supporters acted stupidly and disrespectfully and should have never been sucked into that. And that yo-yo, I showed you pictures, that idiot wearing that bison hat, and then that other moron that was walking across inside the rotunda carrying one of the podiums from the Capitol. I mean, for Pete's sake. So if you're ever at a political rally of any type, and stuff starts happening that you begin to think, ooh, wait, this is not right, get out of there. Because I promise you, these groups put plants in audiences, and they will stir up stuff, and then once they get it going, those people disappear. There's a man right now that they're trying to find who the day before was talking about, we need to go into the Capitol, we need to breach the Capitol. Now all of a sudden nobody can find him. Isn't that interesting? Of course, that's kind of how it works. So that's the church and the IRS, and it's they don't have the power yet. Okay, then let's cover. I think this is the last thing. I don't have my my notes with me here to count these, so we're getting close here. So let's talk about the Johnson Amendment then, because this is one of the things that just terrifies pastors. They're so afraid of disobeying the Johnson Amendment. Well, first of all, I'll tell you, I believe the Johnson Amendment's unconstitutional to start with. I believe it's completely unconstitutional. So what do you mean, Johnson Amendment? Well, Lyndon B. Johnson. The amendment is named after him. So how did it come to be? Well, in 1948, Johnson's senatorial victory was so razor thin with a margin of only 87 votes. Get that. He was elected to his first term as a senator from Texas by a margin of 87 votes. You think there's any chance that there was some stealing going on there and corruption? That Coke Stevenson, his challenger, was able to present pretty credible evidence that Johnson had probably stolen the election through fraud. But with some creative judicial wrangling, Johnson was able to use court injunctions to retain his victory. Now, that was his first time that he was elected. Okay, well, then in 1954, he's running again for senator. Well, because he was a fraud and a crook and deeply connected to the Communist Party, H.L. Hunt down in Texas created two nonprofit groups. One was called Facts and Forum, and the other was called the Committee for Constitutional Government, and they were uncovering the dirt on Lyndon B. Johnson. And if they couldn't prove that he was a communist. They were actually making solid proof that he was soft on communism. Now you got to remember, this is 1954. That was still a bad thing then. If you were called a communist in 1954, you were in trouble and you were finished politically in America. Today, they brag about being socialist, which is just another word for communist. Okay, but then he's in real trouble. So what's he going to do? Well, obviously, he's got to shut these two groups up. Now, how's he going to do that? They're nonprofit. So what he was able to do on July the 1st, 1954, with the assistance of a complicit U.S. Senate, he successfully inserted language into the IRS tax code that silenced these groups and swept him into the Senate once more, known since as the Johnson Amendment. Now, what does the Johnson Amendment basically say? Well, it says that if you're nonprofit, then you cannot participate in, the yellow part, or intervene in, including the publishing or the distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of, and then later on, or in opposition to, was added, any candidate for public office. Now let's stop right there for a moment. There's a big debate as to whether or not Johnson was after the church. I think he wasn't. I think he was after those two conservative groups in Texas that were going to get him beat in his second term. But unfortunately, churches all started becoming 501c3s. And by becoming 501c3s, they fell under this. So, let me ask you, what does speaking out politically about issues have to do with being nonprofit? What does it have to do with that? It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with being nonprofit. Why should a nonprofit organization, especially a religious organization, lose their right to speak about critical political issues? What does that have to do with being nonprofit? See, I believe it has absolutely nothing to do with being nonprofit. So first of all, it's a misapplied concept. I believe it's a misapplied principle. I believe that nonprofits ought to be able to speak out about their own interest as well as any other group. Because remember, they're nonprofit. The group doesn't exist for profit. It's not like Home Depot or, American Airlines. We're talking about a nonprofit to begin with. So what does it have to do with their political? It shouldn't have anything to do with it. Well, if you look into the congressional record, this is all you will find on the Johnson Amendment. That's it. That's the sum total of all government history. And what that is that's actually out of the journal of the proceedings of the Senate in 1954. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read, but what this basically is lingo that was recorded, dictated, and eventually published of the actual discussion that went on when the Johnson Amendment was adopted, and that's all there is. If you go look for more congressional or government information on the Johnson Amendment, there is none. That's all of it. That and the amendment itself. That's it. Now, you can find a lot of writing about the Johnson Amendment, but nothing in the Senate, because that's all there is. See, basically, here's what happened. Johnson was a big wheel in the Senate because he was such a mobster. He bullied everybody, that he was able to slip that through, and nobody probably knew what happened until it was all said and done. More than likely, the conservatives didn't even know what was going on. See, I've been in the legislature enough to know that if you're really well connected, you can slip language into bills that people won't read or have it written in such a way they won't understand, and it goes right by them, and they never know what happened until later on when that is used against them. And I believe that's what happened here. I believe, now remember, this is in the tax code. This is not statutory law, this is tax law. Most senators and representatives don't get all foamed at the mouth about tax law proceedings. So they're not paying close attention anyway. And I believe that's how it happened. So ironically, the Johnson Amendment doesn't even mention pastors, You say, why does that matter? Because all these pastors are running around with a yellow stripe down their backs, and they're so afraid to speak out. Well, the Johnson Amendment has to do with the church, not the pastor. They say, well, he speaks for that organization. And so when they've told me that, I've said, look, I can prove to you that's not true, because I can get up any Sunday and preach on anything, and my members will go out on Monday and prove to me that they don't have to do anything that I say, and they'll do the exact opposite. So it's obvious I don't speak for them. In fact, I don't speak for the church. I speak for God. My job as a pastor is to speak for God, not the church. So you got all these pastors running around scared to death because they're going to break the Johnson Amendment, when the Johnson Amendment doesn't even talk about pastors. Pastors don't shed their First Amendment rights because they've stepped behind the pulpit. In fact, that's when their First Amendment rights are the most critical. So that's why Paul and I, back in 2008, when ADF, at that time it was the Alliance Defense Fund, today it's Alliance Defending Freedom, launched the Pulpit Freedom Initiative. Most of you probably know what that is, but in case you don't, just very quickly, and then we'll wrap things up. The Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional, but no one's ever challenged it. So ADF back in 2008 said, we're going to do the Pulpit Freedom Initiative, and we're going to find about 30-some-odd pastors in America, and we're going to vet them, make sure they're the real deal. We're going to train them, and they're going to get up in their pulpits, and they're going to actually defy the Johnson Amendment, break the law, and then we're going to defend them in court, and we're going to take this thing all the way to the Supreme Court and prove once and for all that the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional. Well, guess who two of the ducks were that lined up in that group of 33 pastors? Paul, Blair, and Dan Fisher. In fact, that's where Paul and I met. I knew of Paul, Paul knew of me, but we'd never met. We met in Scottsdale, Arizona, while we were out there being trained by ADF in preparation for the Pulpit Freedom Initiative 2008. Paul and I both, with 31 other pastors, got up on that Sunday and defied the Johnson Amendment by endorsing John McCain. I couldn't stand John McCain, but he was running against Barack Obama, and John McCain looked like John Adams compared to Barack Obama. So I held my nose, and I officially endorsed John McCain. You say, well, so that's no big deal. Well, but here's what we did the next morning. We'd already prepared letters. We sent copies of our sermons and a cover letter to the IRS saying, this is what I preached yesterday in my pulpit while I was exercising my First Amendment right. Paul and I sent videos of our sermons, manuscripts, the whole deal. This is one of the reasons why many of the pastors preach the gospel so hard, because they knew a lot of those IRS agents don't know Jesus, and they were hoping that some of them would hear the gospel while they're watching these videos. Our hope was that the IRS would come after us, ADF would step in and defend us, we'd take it all the way to the Supreme Court and prove that the Johnson Amendment's unconstitutional. You know what the IRS did? Nothing. And every year after that of a general election, we did the Pulpit Freedom Initiative, and our numbers would grow. Because, see, we actually had a client-attorney privilege agreement with ADF. So this was more than just getting up and doing this. If you were going to be defended by ADF, you had to sign their forms and make sure that you were linked up with them. The last time that we had a Pulpit Freedom Initiative officially, there were over 1,600 pastors, 1,600 that officially participated. And then I'm told hundreds more that were unofficial, meaning that they didn't agree to sign the letter because their church wouldn't let them with ADF, but they still got up and defied the Johnson Amendment. And I'm told that unofficially the IRS said, unofficially, in an unofficial memo, that they don't have the authority to tell pastors what they can preach. But they'll never do that officially. Because, see, that takes away their stick that they're using to beat all these yellow pastors into submission. The Johnson Amendment's unconstitutional. Now, one last thing I want to cover here before we're done, and then we'll pray. And that is, a lot of people say, well, you know, churches ought to not be speaking out politically. Well, it's interesting that in 2016, the Pew Research Center did a study and found that black Protestants have been more likely than other Christian groups to report having heard their clergy speak out clearly on the merits or faults of a particular candidate. In fact, when Barack Obama was running for office, black churches were known to be taking up offerings and giving them to his campaign fund. That was not uncommon at all. The study found 28% of black Protestants heard their clergy speak in support of Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign. 20% of black Protestants said they had heard their ministers denounce Donald Trump. 4% of white evangelicals reported having heard their clergy speak in favor of a presidential candidate. 2% spoke for Trump, 2% for Clinton, while 7% heard their clergy speak against a candidate, mostly Clinton. Notice the huge chasm. 28% of blacks said they'd heard their preacher endorse basically candidates or speak out against candidates. Only 4% of white evangelicals. And by the way, there's a lot more white evangelical churches. Forget about the whole racial component here. There are a whole lot more white evangelical churches in America than there are black evangelical churches. So those percentages mean more in numbers than you might think. Now, I wish that there weren't black evangelical churches and white evangelical churches, but I can tell you a lot of times black churches don't want to join in with so-called white evangelical churches. When I was in Poto, every year we'd swap pulpits with the black church there in town. And Clifton DeHorney was the pastor. Lovely, wonderful man. And I'd preach in his pulpit on a Sunday, and my congregation would go to his church and join his people. And then on a following Sunday, he'd come preach in my church, and his congregation would come join in with us. We thought it was great. In fact, I thought it was so great one time I approached Brother Clifton about possibly merging our two churches. I said, we don't need a black church in Poto. And he said, Brother Danny, I appreciate you saying that. But he said, my people just have ways that are a little different than you guys. For instance, he didn't say this, but they can really get into the music. You white duds just sit there dead like there's nothing to you. And he went on and he laughed and he said, I'll throw it at my leadership, but they probably just want to keep things that way. But I appreciate that. So I don't think that by this study I'm trying to push black evangelicals and white evangelicals. My point is, black preachers are not afraid to speak out their political views. What do you think the IRS does when the black pastors, because mostly the ones who speak out are liberals. What do you think the IRS does about that? You think the IRS went after any of those black churches that took up offerings and gave the money to Barack Obama's campaign fund? No, zero. The reasons should be obvious. So, since the church has been tax exempt since America's founding, and therefore does not have to be a 501c3 to be tax exempt, the Johnson Amendment ultimately violates the First Amendment by limiting freedom of speech and religion. In the end, pastors, churches must preach the truth on every subject, regardless of the cost. Preserving our tax-exempt status should not be our number one goal. Preserving truth and liberty should be. So I would say, even if we were going to lose our tax-exempt status or preach the truth, let's always go with the truth. How about that? But here's the thing. If America's churches don't start standing up and speaking out, the IRS is going to become the Gestapo of America, and pastors are going to be jailed, and churches are going to be taxed, and they're going to try to tax churches into oblivion. And that's the problem with taxing the church. Once you're able to tax the church, you can tax it into non-existence. See that? Remember one of those principles? That's why all of this is so important. That's why it's so important. So let me close with a quote that I began with last week, and here it is. This, of course, is William Booth. He was the founder of the Salvation Army in the 1800s. He said this in the 1800s. The chief danger of the 20th century will be religion without the Holy Ghost, Christianity without Christ, forgiveness without repentance, salvation without regeneration, politics without God, and heaven without hell. what he predicted is what has come true. This is where we are in America. So this is the session that I teach to our pastors at the Liberty Pastors training camps, because I want them to know that they don't have anything to fear, and even if they did, you ought to love the truth more than you fear the government. And so I think that's important for churches to know, and I wanted to teach that here because I wanted you to see not only what we teach those pastors, at least a piece of it,